A woman lies lifeless on the floor, beaten beyond recognition. Her crime. A secret she tried to bury, a truth too dark to hide. The DNA test results she thought would solve everything ended up being the reason her life was brutally cut short. Was it betrayal or revenge? This shocking tragedy isn't just about infidelity, it's about the terrifying lengths one man was willing to go to for the sake of honor. Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth behind this deadly confrontation. A man's life unraveled in the span of a few hours. One single moment, one revelation, ended a marriage and shattered a family. The brutal murder of Linda McDonald was not just about infidelity, it was about betrayal, a betrayal that went deeper than anyone could have imagined. This was no ordinary crime. This was the result of a secret kept too long, a man pushed too far, and a truth so painful it became a catalyst for violence. What happened behind those doors that night? And could it have been avoided? The story you're about to hear is one of rage, revenge, and heartbreak. A tale that doesn't just question love and loyalty, but also asks whether we truly know the people closest to us. Was Thomas MacDonald a man who snapped in a moment of intense emotion, or was there something else, something buried deep within him, that had been building for years? This is a story of dark secrets, shattered trust, and a horrific consequence that no one saw coming. Linda MacDonald was a mother, a wife, and a woman trying to hold her family together. But behind the facade of a perfect life, a devastating truth was lurking. Her affair had been a secret, until the results of a DNA test turned that secret into a deadly confrontation. No one expected the shocking turn of events that would follow. No one could have guessed how Thomas would respond when faced with the reality of his wife's betrayal. In a calm, almost eerie manner, he confronted her. And what followed next was nothing short of terrifying. That night, the echoes of their argument could be heard in the neighborhood. Friends, family, and even those who lived nearby described hearing shouts, crashes, and the sounds of something violent unfolding behind closed doors. For them, the night would end with a devastating discovery. Linda MacDonald lay dead in her own home, her body battered and broken. How did we get here? How did a man who once pledged to love and protect his wife end up taking her life in such a cold, unrecognizable way? Thomas MacDonald's confession, chilling in its simplicity, raised even more questions. Was it truly a moment of uncontrollable rage, or had something more calculating been at play? And what was the tipping point, the one final straw that made him snap? It all began when a simple piece of paper arrived in the mail, DNA test results that would unravel everything. The child Linda had claimed as Thomas's wasn't his at all. The truth of her infidelity was out, and Thomas could no longer ignore it. But was that the whole truth? Or was there more, something he didn't know, that pushed him to do the unthinkable? This is not just the story of a man driven to violence by a lie. It's a story of a marriage built on shaky ground, a husband betrayed not just by his wife, but by his own emotions and pride. And it's about the horror of discovering the truth when it's already too late to fix what's broken. In the aftermath of Linda's murder, friends and family of both the victim and the accused were left to try to make sense of what had happened. How could this happen to someone they knew? Was Thomas always like this, or had this moment been a long time in the making? There were no easy answers. The pain was too fresh, the shock too real. Linda's family grieved the loss of a daughter, a sister, and a mother. Thomas's family, too, struggled to comprehend how the man they thought they knew had become something else entirely. Was Thomas a man who lost control in a fit of jealousy, or was there something more to the story, something darker, something he wasn't telling anyone? Was Linda's affair truly the only factor, or had years of unresolved issues been boiling beneath the surface, waiting to explode? These are questions that no one could answer. Yet, the crime remained. The damage was done. In this documentary, we will peel back the layers of this tragic story. We'll examine the events leading up to Linda's death, the pieces of evidence that pointed to Thomas as the killer, and the heartbreaking aftermath of this violent crime. We'll hear from friends, experts, and those closest to both the victim and the suspect, trying to understand just what went wrong. And perhaps, we'll come to realize that there's more at play here than just a single tragic moment. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was the culmination of years of pain, jealousy, and a dangerous obsession with control. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind Linda McDonald's murder, and ask ourselves, could this have been prevented? Or was this a tragedy waiting to happen? The clock is ticking. The truth is coming to light. Thomas MacDonald had never been a violent man. At least, not until the truth about his wife's betrayal hit him like a freight train. Their marriage, once filled with shared hopes, dreams, and promises of forever, had been slowly crumbling beneath the weight of Linda's secret. Thomas had known something wasn't right. He felt it in the distance between them, the coldness that began to creep into their home, but he never suspected the shocking betrayal that would tear their world apart. The DNA results were the final blow, an undeniable confirmation that his entire life was based on a lie. Linda had always been a woman of mystery, someone who could charm anyone with a smile, someone who appeared perfect to those around her. But there was darkness beneath that smile, a side to her that was hidden from the world. Thomas had trusted her implicitly, never imagining she would have an affair with another man. The pain he must have felt when the DNA test results proved what he feared, that the child she had claimed was his, was not his at all, was unimaginable. The shock of it all shattered something deep inside him, something he could never repair. It was a Saturday night when the confrontation took place. Thomas had come home late from work, a normal day at the office, but nothing would ever be normal again. Linda was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, avoiding his gaze. She knew the moment he walked in that their life together would never be the same. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. For the first time in years, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of rage, a flood of emotion so intense that it seemed to distort everything around him. His world, which had once felt stable, was now crashing down around him. He pulled the letter from his pocket, the one that had changed everything. His hands were shaking as he held it out to her, the paper crinkling between his fingers. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice tight with anger. Linda's eyes darted to the letter, and for a moment, she froze. She knew this was coming. She knew she couldn't hide her secret any longer, but she wasn't ready to face it. Not like this. Not with Thomas standing before her, looking at her as if she were a stranger. "I never meant for you to find out this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was going to tell you. I swear, I was." But Thomas wasn't listening. His anger, fueled by hurt and betrayal, was taking over. His emotions ran rampant, a tidal wave crashing against the walls of his mind. He couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was the voice inside him screaming, demanding justice. "You think you can lie to me, Linda? You think I wouldn't find out?" His words cut through the air, sharp and venomous. The confrontation escalated quickly, their voices rising, the tension thickening with every second. In those moments, the man Linda once knew was gone. What stood before her was someone she didn't recognize, someone consumed by hurt and betrayal. What happened next was so fast, so violent, that it would haunt both their families forever. The argument turned physical. The rage Thomas had bottled up for months, maybe even years, erupted in a violent fury. He grabbed her, shaking her as if trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had loved for so long with the one who had betrayed him so completely. One neighbors later reported hearing a commotion from inside the house, shouts, furniture crashing against the walls, the sound of something being violently overturned. Some even heard Linda screaming, begging for him to stop. But the rage that consumed Thomas was unstoppable. His fists connected with her, his blows landing with brutal force. The fight continued for several minutes, with Linda fighting back as best she could, but it was clear that Thomas had snapped. At some point, the violence escalated. Linda's cries faded as she fell to the floor, helpless. She was no longer the woman who had deceived him, she was just a victim of his blind fury. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. They found Linda's lifeless body in the living room, her once beautiful face unrecognizable from the assault. Thomas was sitting on the floor nearby, his hands trembling as he stared at his wife's body, tears running down his face. He was arrested on the spot, his confession spilling out as soon as the officers asked him what happened. "I didn't mean to do it," he kept repeating over and over. "I didn't mean to hurt her." But the truth was undeniable. Linda MacDonald was dead, and Thomas MacDonald was responsible. The investigation into Linda's death was swift, but even then, there were layers to the story that hadn't been fully understood. As the police pieced together the events of that night, they uncovered the affair, a revelation that shocked everyone who knew the MacDonalds. Linda's infidelity wasn't just the final straw for Thomas, it was the breaking point in a relationship that had been in decline for years. What many didn't know was that Linda's affair had been ongoing for months, and the child she had claimed was Thomas's was the product of that affair. The DNA test had been the tipping point, but it was clear that something much deeper was at play. There were whispers about a controlling nature in their marriage, accusations that Thomas had always kept a tight grip on Linda's life, her friendships, even her career. He had kept a close eye on her, checking her phone, demanding to know where she was at all times. In some ways, Linda's affair had been her desperate attempt to reclaim control of her own life. But in the end, it was her desire to hide that truth from Thomas that led to her tragic demise. The trial was emotionally charged. Family members from both sides took the stand, each describing the person they had known and loved. Thomas's defense argued that he was not a violent man, that he had snapped in a moment of intense emotion. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a man who had been controlling and abusive, who had let his jealousy and insecurity take over. The courtroom was divided, and the community, too, was torn. Some believed Thomas was a victim of his emotions, a man driven to madness by the ultimate betrayal. Others believed he was a cold-blooded killer who had been plotting his revenge for months. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day revealing more about the fractured relationship between the MacDonalds. And as the verdict approached, the tension was unbearable. Would Thomas be found guilty of murder? Or would his emotional state be enough to convince the jury that he was not fully responsible for what had happened? And so, the question remained. Was this a crime of passion, a man losing control in a moment of heartbreak? Or was it something darker, a premeditated act of vengeance for a betrayal that could never be forgiven? The answer was not as simple as it seemed. This case was filled with layers of emotion, manipulation, and regret that no one could have anticipated. And in the end, there were no winners. Only the wreckage left behind from a life destroyed by secrets, lies, and one terrible act of violence. As the trial concluded and the verdict was read, both families were left to grapple with the fallout. Linda's family mourned her loss, trying to make sense of how a woman they had loved could have been taken so violently. Thomas's family, too, struggled with the reality of what had happened. The man they had known was gone, replaced by a criminal who would forever be defined by the horrific act he had committed. The scars from this tragedy would never heal. Not for Thomas, not for Linda, and not for the people who had been caught in the crossfire of a love turned deadly. In the end, this wasn't just a story of a man killing his wife, it was a story of how secrets, lies, and jealousy can destroy everything in their path, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. In the weeks that followed the trial, the haunting echoes of the crime continued to reverberate through the small town where the MacDonalds had lived. Linda's family, though devastated by her death, found themselves caught in a whirlwind of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. They couldn't understand how someone they had known for so long, someone they had trusted, could commit such a brutal act. But perhaps the hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that their beloved Linda, the woman they thought they knew, had led such a secret life. It was hard to reconcile the loving, dedicated wife they had seen with the woman who had secretly betrayed her husband, the man she had sworn to love and honor for better or worse. Linda's affair with another man, which had been discovered posthumously through the DNA test results, had been a source of intense heartache for her family. To them, it wasn't just the affair that was shocking, it was the secrecy surrounding it. Linda had been good at hiding things, so good that it seemed she had built an entirely different life outside the one she had shared with Thomas. The man she had been involved with, Keith Adams, was someone Linda had known for several years. They'd met at work, and the affair had escalated over time, with Keith becoming a constant presence in her life. For Linda, It had been an escape from a marriage she had grown increasingly disillusioned with. But for Thomas, it had been the ultimate betrayal. Linda's family, though supportive of her, couldn't ignore the pain that was also felt by Thomas's relatives. They were torn between sympathy for the man they had known and a deep sense of anger over the loss of Linda. Thomas had been part of their family for over a decade, and to some, it seemed impossible that he could be capable of such violence. They had seen him as a loving husband, a hard-working man who had always done what was expected of him. To them, this violent outburst seemed like an unexplainable shift, an uncharacteristic act that had been triggered by the revelation of Linda's betrayal. As Thomas's trial came to a close, the jury deliberated, weighed down by the emotional complexity of the case. They weren't simply deciding whether Thomas had killed his wife, they were deciding whether a man who had been pushed to the edge by emotional devastation could truly be held accountable for his actions. The prosecution argued that Thomas was a man who had allowed his jealousy to drive him to murder, while the defense insisted that he was a man who had been emotionally overwhelmed by the betrayal of the one person he trusted most. The prosecution painted Thomas as someone who had been controlling and emotionally abusive, someone who couldn't handle the shock of his wife's affair and took matters into his own hands. The defense, however, suggested that Thomas had lost control in a moment of raw emotion, his reaction to the DNA results clouded by years of frustration, anger, and suspicion. The jury's decision came after hours of tense deliberation. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the weight of their verdict hung heavily in the air. The courtroom was silent as the judge asked the foreman to announce the decision. The words that followed would forever alter the lives of everyone involved: guilty of second-degree murder. Thomas MacDonald was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of his wife, Linda MacDonald. The sentence was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some in the courtroom, including members of Linda's family, found some semblance of justice in the verdict. Others, particularly Thomas's family, were left to grapple with the reality of the man they had loved being forever defined by his crime, but while the trial had ended, the ripple effects of the murder continued to unfold. The MacDonald family, divided by the tragedy, struggled to rebuild their lives. Thomas's mother, a deeply religious woman, refused to believe that her son was capable of cold-blooded murder. She held on to the belief that Thomas's actions had been the result of an overwhelming emotional breakdown, a fleeting moment of madness that had been triggered by the overwhelming pain of his wife's betrayal. She spoke publicly about her son's character, about how he had always been kind-hearted and loving. It was clear that she couldn't come to terms with the idea that her son had taken another person's life. And in some ways, she never truly did. Linda's family, meanwhile, had to find a way to move on from the pain of her loss. Her parents, who had been so proud of their daughter's accomplishments, felt the weight of her death every day. Her father, a quiet man, could never understand how Linda had kept her affair secret for so long. He was tormented by the thought that perhaps he hadn't been there for her in the way he should have been. Linda's mother, on the other hand, found herself questioning everything about her daughter's life. Had she really known her at all? How could Linda have kept such a huge secret? And what had driven her to make the choices she did? These were questions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As time passed, both families struggled with the aftermath of the crime. Friends and acquaintances of the MacDonalds could not reconcile the man they had once known with the man who had been convicted of murder. They had seen Thomas as someone trustworthy, dependable, and loving. They couldn't understand how he could have changed so drastically. Some whispered about the possibility of long-buried anger, of control issues in his marriage. Others suggested that he had simply snapped under the weight of betrayal. But the truth was more complicated than anyone could imagine. What few people knew was that Thomas had been battling personal demons for years. The signs had been subtle, at least to those around him, but there had always been a darkness in him that he kept hidden. Linda's affair was the final catalyst, the spark that ignited the explosive violence that no one had seen coming. Perhaps the biggest tragedy was that no one had seen the signs before it was too late. His love for Linda had been possessive, obsessive even, and when that trust was shattered, it became too much for him to bear. His actions that night were the culmination of years of emotional turmoil, confusion, and betrayal. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about losing the person who had been the center of his world. For those who knew Thomas, the trial had been a wake-up call. They had never suspected that he was capable of such violence. And yet, as the case unraveled, they had to come to terms with the fact that the man they had loved had harbored a darkness that no one could have predicted. But the finality of the verdict, the cold truth that Thomas had taken Linda's life, was something that could never be undone. As Thomas served his time, he was forced to confront the reality of his crime every day. The guilt, the regret, the overwhelming sadness, it all weighed heavily on him. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make sense of the moment that had destroyed everything. Linda's family would never fully recover from the loss of their daughter, and Thomas's family would have to find a way to rebuild their lives without him. The tragedy of the MacDonald case would never be forgotten, and it would continue to haunt everyone involved for years to come. The haunting question remained: how far could love go before it turned into obsession? And how much betrayal could one person take before they were driven to the edge? These questions lingered long after the courtroom doors had closed, leaving a trail of pain and unanswered questions in their wake. Now that you've heard the full story, we want to know your thoughts. Do you believe Thomas's actions were a result of emotional breakdown, or was this a carefully calculated crime of rage? What do you think about the role Linda's affair played in the tragic events that unfolded? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the right verdict was reached? Were there deeper issues in their marriage that could have been prevented? Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime cases. Hit the like button if you think justice was served, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this shocking story. We'll see you in the next one.